Everyone, I'll keep I'll keep myself very short because I think you're here for the presenters, not so much for myself. For myself, what I wanted to say is that what we're producing here, presenting here, are two policy briefs, which are part of a larger series of, in the end, what we hope will be 20 policy briefs, and they will be a part of the EU-funded Germany network called PolyCIVIS. And in the chat, if you're interested, I'll post a link on where to access our policy briefs here. So if you find it so exciting what we do, then please have a look at them. Today we're also partnering with a very well-known think tank in Brussels. So we've done that already earlier this year. We're very extremely happy that ECDPM is again available for us. I think it's a good choice because this particular think tank really works on African and European issues across the board, and this is what we also want to achieve. We want to, bring the issue of the Polycrisis on the table, on the map here, with all its facets. And that should be all from my side. I'll be happy to hand over to you again, Faith.
Thank you very much, Malte. So in kicking us off, just a quick note on our first presentation, which will be done by Dr. Daniel Hoyer. Just a brief overview of who Dr. Hoyer is. He's a computational historian and complexity scientist, and he is currently based at working with social dynamics, which is called SODI, which is focusing mostly on complexity science, located in Vienna. He's also affiliated with the Evolution Institute and Social AI Lab at the University of Toronto. He's also a member of the UN Foundation that hosted Accelerating Systemic Risk Assessment. His research particularly looks to focus and zero in on societal responses to shifting ecological, social, and economic contexts that determine well-being outcomes in the past, as well as how this may shed light on critical social pressures today. And in starting us off, we'll be speaking to the policy brief on 14 years after the Arab Spring, looking at Egypt's polycrisis risks and potential for civil unrest. It's a policy brief that he co-wrote with his colleague, Rachel, who's not here, but I'm sure he'll be well represented. Over to you, Daniel.
Well, thank you so much, and hopefully you can all hear me. I had a little bit of trouble logging in, but I'm here now. Things seem to be working. Let's see if I can share my screen, in fact, which would be amazing. Yes, I should be able to do this. Can you all see this now? This is happening? Yes, we're getting a thumbs up. Yes, yay. Okay, yes. Excellent. Good. So I'll try to keep my remarks as brief as possible. This is based on a brief that's about to be published very soon through the PolyCIVIS brief series. Very, very happy to be here. I'm actually based in Toronto, even though I am affiliated with Vienna, so it's a little bit complicated, a little bit early in the morning for me, but I have my coffee, so we are okay. And unfortunately, Rachel, my colleague, can't be here. She's really an amazing young researcher and expert in revolutions in a polycrisis context, and we're going to be talking about that, revolutions in the past, revolutions that may be happening in the future or even currently, and just what this means in our interconnected, high-risk polycrisis-like environment that we have. Whoops. So when we talk about Egypt in our modern polycrisis, I think just a little quick note about who sort of we are at Societal Dynamics, or SODI. We call ourselves the Historical Policy Lab. Really, we try to take all of our work on understanding the dynamics of societies, how they have expressed in the past, have they looked after the well-being of their citizens, have they failed to do so, and if so, why? Why do they get themselves into trouble? Why do they encounter crises? Why do the crises take the different shapes that we see them do? And then use that knowledge of looking back to help us in the present and help us sort of move to a better future, right? Come up with interventions that are historically informed, what has worked, what hasn't worked. If we take that sort of macro level view of the issues, what are the long-term stressors? What are the ways that things interact over time? Does that lead to different sorts of solutions, different sorts of, let's say, policy interventions that can target those longer, deeper roots of the dysfunction, in addition to the sort of manifestations and what you might call the symptoms of polycrisis? This is just our general view in our work. When we bring that approach and bring that sort of framework to look at Egypt, well, we first, we look to the past a little bit, and not even that long ago, but we look at 2011, the so-called Arab Spring. And so what is going on with Egypt at the time? What's the context? What's happening? Egypt and, of course, many other countries. Well, there's a global recession just a few years earlier. The manifestations of that are still being felt, the implications of that. There's a lot of ecological distress in the region. Egypt in particular is very vulnerable and always has been for thousands of years to the sort of inundations of the Nile and water resources and aridification, desertification. These are stressors that are playing out in the run-up to the Arab Spring as well. Food shortages because of the ecological and environmental distress, because of the global economic situation as well. These factors are interacting, other conflicts in other parts of the world. Egypt is very, and for a long time has been very heavily reliant on imports for their food security. They're, I think, the biggest wheat importer in the world. But there's also these long-term stresses, right? And these are things that are not happening all of a sudden overnight. They build for years, even decades or generations, right? Immiseration, declining well-being for large segments of the population, inequality, lack of access to key public goods, housing, healthcare, education, etc. Youth unemployment is sort of part of this as well. Structural scarcity, just a lack of opportunities, a lack of advancement, a lack of access to the things that people want and need to live good lives. Just leads to a lot of frustration, a lot of anger, and again, that builds up over long periods of time. Crony capitalism, we might say, there's a lot of sort of what looks to be corruption at the top. There's a lot of, this is the other side of that inequality, is the sort of closed ranks of what we might call political and economic elites, keeping the lion's share of resources and opportunities for themselves, but also tensions in between and among those elite groups as well, right, that are sort of ready to crack. So all of these stressors are building, they're growing, they're demanding some kind of release, and they're sort of staying there under the surface until a triggering event happens. And we see a number of these in 2011. There's, of course, the self-immolation of the fruit vendor Bouazizi in Tunisia. There's the National Police Day in Egypt, which sort of spawned a series of protests, which ended up spiraling into full-blown revolution. And then there's, of course, the crackdowns to some of those protests and to some of the manifestations of this anger, which then sort of triggered an even greater response from the population. So all of these things conspire together and produce what we call the Arab Spring. This is the polycrisis, full stop, right? This is the clear example and sort of manifestation of what a polycrisis is. All of these stresses, all of these risks, and along with a number of triggering events that can lead to these sort of very significant events. But of course, and Rachel is very, in particular, really great at talking about, okay, well, revolutions, yes, they are spawned by all of these interconnected stressors in a polycrisis, but the polycrisis doesn't go away after the thing happens, right? The revolution, these sorts of events, these actions and behaviors feed back into the polycrisis, and then that sort of continues in the years to come. So then we look ahead to, well, what is Egypt like today? What has changed? What stayed the same? What's going on? And we find that sort of the country today facing a lot of ecological distress. That's not going anywhere. That's only getting more acute as anthropogenic climate change continues. Same sort of food shortages, global economic fluctuations, conflict in other parts of the world, disrupting trade, high inflation because of a lot of these issues, making it more difficult to access food and other key resources. The same long-term stresses were never fully taken care of even during the revolution, even the ousting of Mubarak. Immiseration is still there, youth unemployment is still there, structural scarcity is still there. still charges of crony capitalism, still the same kind of intra-elite tensions, a lot of the same stresses, a lot of the same context that we saw in 2011 are still there. Many of them have actually gotten more acute and harsher. Some recent actions, the sort of CC regime is focusing on these kind of mega projects, a new administrative capital, and this image is sort of a imagining of what that looks like. Really focus on sort of cash cropping. Let's lean into agriculture, which is one of the biggest industries in Egypt. Sort of reclaiming parts of the desert for food growing, focusing on, high value export crops. But this is sort of exacerbating a lot of the issues. High debt burdens being raised in order to fund these mega products. This is just increasing the vulnerability of the country to these cash crops, which are very susceptible to a bad rain year, a bad harvest year. This has always been the case in Egypt. This is just becoming more acute with some of these actions. And again, all of the reclamation work, the sort of water that's being drawn out, and the way that it's sort of being done can actually, experts sort of seem to suggest, this has a high potential to lead to even further aridification. Where I was. So we're talking about Egypt in the present. And really the key point is that so many of the longer term stresses, so many of these risks that seem to foment the Arab Spring revolutions are still present and at least as severe as they were then. In a way, you might say that, the pressures are there. They're just waiting their moment for release. And there are triggers in the world, right? It's unclear exactly what is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back, so to speak, and sort of leads to another round of events. We are seeing the same kind of police crackdowns, the same kind of suppression of dissent that we saw in the run-up to the Arab Spring. We're seeing very similar style youth-led protests in other parts of the continent, and other parts of the world. Kenya, Morocco, Madagascar in recent years, and in fact recent weeks, and other parts of the world as well. These may end up spiraling into triggers in a similar way as we saw back in 2011, regional tensions and conflicts elsewhere. There's a lot of things in place, right? It's still, the polycrisis is just as acute, probably even deeper than it was before. Locally, a lot of the same pressures are there. So really not much has actually changed since 2011. Some of the faces are different, some of the names are different. The core structural issues are very, very similar. So what can be done about it? What is this perspective, this sort of longer term, this polycrisis perspective, what does it have to say about what you can actually do? Well, this is what we are trying to do at SODI, is say, okay, well, if you explore these things, if you take this bigger picture, longer term historical view, well, then how do you treat the underlying pressures, right? And not just, treat the disease and not just the symptoms. So we have some recommendations in three sort of domains: the environmental, economic, and what we would call social political. So again, agriculture is a major industry. It's majorly important. It's key for well-being, for achieving the food security. Moving to, again, sustainable, renewable resources, not the sort of mega project, put all your baskets in one kind of cash crop regime that seems to be raising the vulnerabilities. The way to reduce that is with some, more sustainable, more renewable sort of agriculture, diversifying sort of the portfolio, the degree of economic activity, really focus on smallholders, really focus on protecting and elevating labor, and sort of really taking care of some of that immiseration that drives a lot of the unrest and a lot of the sort of revolutions that we see around the world. Right? These are legitimate issues that drive the sort of social unrest, and so you need to actually address them meaningfully. Monitoring and enforcement, like making sure, being a little more transparent, making sure that your practices actually are sustainable, that your, these sorts of mega projects are not going to defeat their own purpose, that there is a way to sort of have that information shared, have that knowledge used to make these sort of more sustainable decisions. Prepare for the urbanization that is likely coming, again, as the sort of desertification continues, as rural economic prospects continue to dwindle. We're going to see a continuing increase in people moving into the cities. we need to prepare for that with the infrastructure, build housing, build the infrastructure, build sewage and water and other issues that are going to be needed. Get ready for that now because it's coming. It may not seem like an acute issue right now, but it is going to be. And so, getting ahead of that is a major issue. And again, the transparency, the accountability, the anti-corruption, these have been long issues in the country, in the region, and in many parts of the world, in fact. And, there's difficult to actually do in practice, especially when you're dealing with the political leaders who may be resistant to some of these changes. But it actually is in everyone's longer term interest. Really, what this comes down to, and this is something we see historically and we see all over the place, you need to rebuild the sort of social trust and the social capital that is needed to do the other things that are required to face the polycrisis, whether it's the economic, the environmental interventions that are needed. You can't do anything if you don't have the sort of social political capital to do so. So rebuilding that is an absolute sine qua non for any other sort of actions you might take. And I think this is something that really comes out of our historical analysis really well. So that's a very quick lightning overview, left a lot of details on the table. Would love to get into it in the discussion, but I will leave it there, and thank you very much for your attention. Let me stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much, Daniel, and I appreciate that you've really launched into a comprehensive overview and given us a proper lay of the land and really appreciating the context-specific elements of how the polycrisis is playing out in the Egyptian context. I actually found it very interesting in how the concept that you and Rachel discuss around really framing the Arab Spring Revolution, of course, the birthplace of it being Egypt, and contextualizing it within this phenomenon that we're discussing of the polycrisis, and really advancing some of the solutions that you cut across the various dimensions, various sectors. And you're right in saying that there's much more to be discussed. We'll leave it up and hear some of the insights from the floor. But I think also as you were speaking and outlining some of the solutions and policy recommendations, I was just trying to think about how it opens up a very interesting conversation about how policymakers need to begin approaching a lot of the responses in a more coordinated, integrated manner, right? Rather than looking at it from a siloed approach. In as much as the solutions are very sector specific, but overall in terms of implementation, we can't overlook the integrative element of it. And I'm happy to hear some of the remarks later on when we open it up for discussion. In saying that, I think the next step will be to hear from our second key policy brief that we'd like to zero in and hopefully shed light on. Our next speaker is Dr. Sahid Lawal, who's a sociologist and global health scholar. He's currently a lecturer at the University of Babcock in Nigeria, lecturing at the Department of Public Health. His key areas of research include behavioral health, health policy, administration, and management, public health, and primary care, among others. He's going to speak to us about specifically polycrisis and the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa. Over to you, Dr. Lawal.
Thank you very much, Faith. Greetings, everyone. Let me pull up my slide. Okay, can you all see my slide?
Yes, we can. Can you put it to full screen? That would be good.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, how's this? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity. I'll be speaking on, as Faith mentioned, polycrisis and the attainment of the SDGs. This is very important to each and every one of us. The global sustainable development goals that had been in existence for some few years, come the next couple of years, precisely the next 5 years, we'll have to look back and ask ourselves, how have we fared, not just in Africa, but globally across the world? So talking about polycrisis, building on what had been initially spoken by my first, by the first speaker, we look at the world as it is. I would say the world is in chaos. It's in chaos, it's full of a lot of global disruptions. From the global north to the global south, there are quite a lot of uncertainties all across the world. And as these crises continue to occur, as they continue to emerge, it will continue to affect the very fabric of society, and that's the social life of what individuals from in the society, whether they find themselves in a rural area or they find themselves in an urban setting. All the dimensions of polycrisis will continue to affect people on a daily basis. So the question is, how did we get here? I look at the world and I say it's a lot of global disunity as a result of the global disunity that the world is currently faced with, and also the issue of racism. I believe you could see my slides. I'm on the next slide. Then also global power tussle. Thank you. Then the question of planet abuse. And this is really affecting the planet in several ways. Then, of course, the issue of self-interest over collective interest. To a large extent, we have self-interest, you know, when it overrides collective interest, the collective goodwill of everyone in the world, it's a big problem. And I came across this concept many years ago, and it's the concept of we and togetherness. This is something that those in South Africa are very familiar with, the Ubuntu. So as a result of lack of we and, you know, collective togetherness in the world, I would say the polycrisis will continue to emerge and re-emerge in different ways. Taking the ideas of one of the eminent scholars in the discourse of polycrisis, he's talking about, you know, crisis in multiple dimensions, crises that are degrading the very fabric of society and also the humanity that you look at the world today, a lot of disasters here and there, a lot of global social problems, issues happening. We have varied emergencies occurring across the world. Then I came across this particular diagram. I find it quite very interesting. You know, the largest risks faced by the world today and in the next 10 years. One of those risks happens to be misinformation. It's quite interesting how much misinformation can trigger people in different parts of the world, and people will begin to take actions online, offline, and people would make the wrong decisions, wrong actions, deliberate actions will be taken, and policy will be developed based on the wrong premise. Then, of course, the issue of extreme weather is also a major global challenge. We have armed conflicts happening in different parts of the world, especially in the global south. The issue of global pollution, the growing level of social inequality that we're experiencing in the world. All of these are dimensions of risk that the world are faced with. Well, when we break it down, we understand this to be what polycrisis. Then, of course, if you look at this particular slide, you see this is taken from the World Economic Forum. The global risk landscape shows the interconnected and interdependent and interrelated nature of risk that the world is faced with today, how one level of risk is affecting another. And that brings me to, you know, the slides I have where I'll be showing examples of how risk in different parts of Africa are affecting the daily lives of people. So why does polycrisis exist and why does it continue to persist? As long as we have, you know, structural and systemic failures in governance, we have these in countries, from one country to another, in Africa, all of these will continue to increase the levels of polycrisis that we are faced with in the continent of Africa. Yeah, for the sake of time, just to bring our minds back to the SDGs, we are all familiar with the SDGs. The world is committed to addressing the issue of poverty, the issue of hunger, also improving health and well-being across the world, and other SDGs. Now, to this particular table, taking examples from Nigeria and the DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo. In Nigeria, since year 2002, we've had the issue of Boko Haram insurgency. Boko Haram insurgency in the far north of Nigeria has affected every fabric of existence and life for the people in rural communities, and even people in urban communities are not 100% safe. It has led to displacement in terms of agricultural produce. People are not safe. They don't feel confident going to their farms to work. And of course, this has affected the food security and food structure in the country. If you connect this to how it's related to the SDGs, it's leading to increased poverty. It's also affecting food security, and it has also affected education. So many years ago, the Boko Haram insurgents went into a school. They kidnapped and took quite a lot of young girls from the school, and that issue till date has just been swept under the carpet. Then, of course, we have a recurrent climate crisis. Sadly enough, sometime in the month of May in Nigeria, we had a flooding in a state called Niger State. It led to the passing away of 161 persons. 161 people lost their lives. So these are challenges. Then if you come down to the DRC, data from different sources, including the Council for Foreign Relations, gives us an understanding that the crisis and the armed conflict in the DRC, which has been since 1966, had gone on to affect the country, and it had led to over 6 million deaths. And of course, the continuing reoccurrence of Ebola in the DRC, the most recent occurred October the 7th. And that's the country recorded a total number of 64 confirmed cases, of which of that 64, 42 lost their lives. So these are issues connected to the level of occurring crisis in the world, more importantly, specifically to Africa. And in different dimensions, these are affecting the way Africans are positioned to attain the Sustainable Development Goals. And this is not good for the continent as a whole. Then, of course, looking at this particular slide, just to buttress the fact that as long as the polycrisis persists, it will continue to hinder the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Africa already has different dynamics and varied challenges on different levels, at the macro level, at the meso level, at the micro level. These challenges persist. And of course, addressing this polycrisis, we need innovative strategies, but these strategies must be driven with cultural sensitivity in mind, and it must be context specific to different countries, different regions across the continent of Africa. So as I begin to conclude, I want to pick on one of the policy recommendations: investment in human capital and inclusive governance. It's very important that, the health system in Africa is strengthened. When the health system in Africa is strengthened, it will go a long way to reduce the global burden of disease that is associated with Africa. When you look at the data from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in Washington, and you look at how that data is presented, the global burden of disease, Africa records the highest. So we need to invest in the right human capital, improve the human resources for health, of course, address issues that has to do with what? Education. Education is fundamental. Education is a bedrock to building sustainable societies in the world. Also, we need to empower women and empower children, empower the youths, empower the young ones. And this will be done through what? Innovative entrepreneurship models. We have a couple of them. There is need for more. And of course, strengthening democratic institutions, we go a long way. If you look at the slides, you could see how each of these, in terms of investments in human capital and inclusive governance, relates to specific sustainable development goals and how these will be realized. And of course, it's very important that Africa comes together to address all forms of polycrisis. This is with the aim of achieving the sustainable development goals. The sustainable development goals are not something far off from our grasp. It's not something that cannot be realized, but to a large extent, we all have to work together in order for us to address the existing polycrisis in not one part of Africa, but across the continent, and with the hope of a better tomorrow. So I want to say thank you for listening.
Indeed, thank you very much, Dr. Lawal, for that presentation. I think you really presented an interesting perspective on understanding the SDG as a particular entry point. And what I appreciated also from your presentation was, in as much as the SDG is a very wide topic, I appreciated the way that you tried to zero in on 4 particular policy recommendations, which you sort of framed as a very polycentric element, a starting conversation for how implementing those particular 4 recommendations would really begin to have a multiplier effect in terms of adequate and flexible policy responses to SDGs. I think that was a very interesting way of you putting it. And also in your brief, I liked how you restated the centrality of the argument about addressing polycrisis from a policy perspective, meaning that we're not just looking at risk management, that we are also beginning to really appreciate the importance of reshaping and reorienting development trajectories. And I think that's a good point for me to hand over the reins to our co-host, ECDPM, to Sarah Janaselo, who's a youth and gender focal point. She'll help guide and facilitate the discussion segment of our webinar, and also web into the Q&A session where we'll open up to the floor. So over to you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Faith. I hope you can all hear me well. My name is Sarah. I'm a policy analyst in ECDPM. Thank you for inviting me today to facilitate this session. I was really fascinated with the depth of the policy briefs, and I learned also so many things. So I wanted to thank you indeed for writing them. I found them really, really interesting, and I prepared a couple of questions for both of you, so we can dig a bit in the policy brief that you wrote. So maybe I would like to start with Daniel, if it's possible. So when reading your policy brief, I was really indeed fascinated with how you were able to put together the past, as you were saying, so look at the past history of Egypt and what lessons can be learned to then look at what's next, what can we do to avoid that problems and mistakes of the past are actually repeated. So you frame indeed your paper and Egypt's current challenges through the concept of polycrisis. And I found that you delineate very well the different crises, climate change, water scarcity, population growth, and you describe also how one crisis impacts the other, and they feed on one another. So our first question for you was, how do you see the polycrisis framework changing the way policymakers and analysts understand instability and resilience compared to a more traditional and siloed approach that maybe we have today? And the second question would also be, what lessons then can Egypt's situation teach us about managing this polycrisis more broadly, for example, in other regions or globally? Thanks.
Well, thank you. I mean, those are big and very important questions, and I don't know if I can answer them fully, but I mean, I certainly, yeah, would love to sort of talk more about it and hear everyone else's thoughts as well. And I think, I mean, these are great questions, and they harken back to what my colleague Dr. Lawal just presented, and I think what Faith, what you had been mentioning in some of your remarks as well. The siloed approach, it's not fit for purpose, right? And as you're saying, Sarah, like, so much of the reaction, and I'm an academic and I'm only in recent years starting to get into the sort of policy space, but what I've encountered, and when I speak with colleagues who have more experience, this is that common issue is, well, the way it works is you have your different departments, and you have your environmental department or your energy department or your police department or whatever it happens to be, and you have a very specific mandate, and you are not even allowed in many ways to go beyond the issue or your dimension. And that's by design. And it's okay, well, you do this, you're a specialist, you do that, you're a specialist in this. And that makes sense. There's some efficiency there. You can see why that would happen, right? Not everybody can do everything, but that just doesn't fit the polycrisis kind of moment, right? It suggests that each issue is its own specific thing. It's disconnected from the other drivers of dysfunction, and therefore it can be addressed on its own by specialists who only work on that, whatever it happens to be. And as we've seen, as we're all talking about, the polycrisis is the opposite of that, right? Dr. Laval was showing really well. It's an interconnected web of different drivers. And so just logically, you cannot just pick one of the dimensions and try to focus on it. That's not going to work. And so it has to be this sort of suite of interconnected solutions and interventions to tackle the suite of interconnected problems. The way I kind of think about it is that, we talk about sometimes polycrisis as the vicious cycle because of all these interconnections. Environmental distress can lead to food scarcity and unrest. That can lead to violent conflict. That can lead to sort of government crackdowns and authoritarianism. That can maybe lead to further extractive policies in order to fund that, and it becomes a sort of cycle, right? Each sort of outcome feeds the next one, and it sort of creates this feedback loop. But the logic, like it just makes sense that those same relationships should and can be moved in the other direction, right? We can flip the vicious cycle into a virtuous cycle through those same relationships, and I think this is where we get into what are then the lessons that we can take away from some of these moments? And this is the other kind of key thing that I wanted to stress. And Rachel has written about this a lot, actually. She does a very good job of noting that, we talk about revolutions as a sort of failure of the state or of the society. Yeah, but it's not a failure to maintain stability. It's a failure to provide for the well-being and look after your citizens, and the anger and the frustration that generates, that leads to the unrest, right? So the response of cracking down on dissent is misguided. Really what it shows is that, well, unrest is a sign that you have not been doing your job. You're not taking care of your citizens. You're not looking after your human capital. You're not looking after your environment. You're not taking care of non-human species. So the way to battle unrest isn't to wait for it to happen and then, lock everybody up. That doesn't work. And historically, we've seen that fails 100% of the time. You have to actually tackle the drivers of the unrest itself to make people not want to or not need to have a revolution, right? And so this involves taking care of all of these different interconnected dimensions. Human capital is a major one. I guess what I would caution and what we learn historically is human capital, even something like education, is fantastic and it is its own good, but it has to be accompanied by other things, right? If you're educating people and spending a lot on that, great, but you still have all the sort of structural scarcity that we talked about that you've seen in sort of Egypt and other parts of the world, then there's a sort of disconnect there, and that can actually exacerbate unrest. So education, yeah, but education alongside opportunities and advancement and inclusiveness and participation and giving everyone actually a seat at the table when you're, educating them about how important it is to have a seat at the table, right? So it has to be a full package. And I think that's the sort of lesson. We can go on, but I think that's really what polycrisis means, is polycrisis requires polysolutions, is maybe the pithy way to say it.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting what you're suggesting, because it's a kind of like a change of mindset of how we approach things. And sometimes that's what's challenging in nature, because we're so used to always applying the same methods that's even difficult to see how we can do things differently. So for me, it's a matter of like, changing our mindset and approaching this from a polycrisis point of view. But also, as you said, like the design itself of the system, because everything is so siloed that if we don't first change that, we cannot then have interconnected solutions. So thanks, that was really clear. And I think that also connects me to Dr. Lowell. In order to, I would like to ask you also some questions. And I have to say that when I read both your papers together, it was really fascinating how to see actually how one paper really looked at this polycrisis from a country perspective, while the other one took a more continental perspective. And it was really interesting to see how one could potentially feed the other, but they were complementary also. So my question for you, Dr. Lowell, maybe it's a bit specific, but I was really curious to understand a bit more better how you see this polycrisis at the continental level, how the way that you described it before so well, playing out with the context-specific and cultural sensitive approaches. So in your paper, you write that there is a need for more context-specific and cultural sensitive approaches to policy. And I was wondering how can then Africa balance the global SDGs agenda, and also the need to push for regional cooperation, and as you were saying, for the togetherness to come together with actual local realities and tradition. If there is, of course, a way. I guess it's not really an easy question. And the second one that I wanted to ask to you was, if you look across the continent, what examples of resilience and or innovation there are that offer you hope to tackle this polycrisis in an integrated manner, to say we can still reach the SDGs before the, let's say, expiration date. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Yes, from a continental perspective, that is quite large. It's a big dream, but every dream is achievable. It just depends on how much you want to commit to achieving those dreams. I would say from a cultural sensitive lens, I remember when I first, some years back, when I met a colleague, he's from Uganda, and we started interacting with one another. We're sharing, life experiences, what it's like living in Kampala. I lived most of my life in Lagos, Nigeria. And it came to a point where we realized that we are not so very different in terms of our, experiences, in terms of the things that we have come through, education-wise, policy-wise, polity-wise, in terms of the political structure, the way the political structure is set up in Uganda, the way the political structure is set up in, Nigeria, the difference between the haves and the have-nots, and all of these dimensions. And of course, the challenges in the area of agriculture, the challenges in the area of sports. We both got onto the Global Health Program. So we began to discuss more about the challenges in the health sector. We realized that the same way Uganda depends on foreign donors, we also have, Nigeria depending on foreign donors, and we have similar issues as regards low budget funding. What I'm just trying to say is that we are not so different. So when you look at the cultural realities in different parts of Africa, this is somebody that has lived all his life in the eastern part of Africa, myself in the western part of Africa, the west of Africa. We could see our similarities. So as a result of that, when we're designing, policies, where we're designing strategies to address existing challenges that are similar across Africa, we must also take into consideration that the culture of the people, to a large extent, drives the way they live their life. Besides, culture is a way of life. So to a large extent, when we take that into consideration in how we address issues, not taking the cultural realities of the people out of the solution, then there is a likelihood that those solutions and those strategies will most likely succeed. And of course, I remember some years back, I did a project, funded by, the NIH and all of that, and I focused on community engagement. Whether you are using the vertical approach or you're using the horizontal approach, it's very important that you engage communities correctly. You carry communities along in the building, the conceptualization process throughout the entire, execution of that particular project. And once the community buys in, there is every possibility that what you are introducing, whether it is culture sensitive or context specific, to a large extent, it will likely succeed. And that's how we can create balance. We have to bring everybody to the drawing board, irrespective of their irrespective of existing social class, social differences that we find in our societies, in the 21st century. We just have to meet everybody, where they are. We just have to meet them. The way we approach people in rural communities, the way we approach people in semi-urban communities, and of course the urban communities, those approaches might be similar because they live in the same countries, but we just have to know that their realities and their worldviews are not the same. So that's how to create balance. Then talking about resilience, whether we like it or not, I would use Nigeria as an example. Many years ago, we had the issue of, the high incidence and occurrence of, polio in Nigeria. But over time, that had been greatly reduced, that had been addressed. And it's all about the fact that people want a better life. People want something different. People are aspiring, looking up to the policymakers, looking up to the political class, the political thinkers. They are also looking up to the technocrats to find the right solutions to address their problems. People want to see solutions to the existing problems. As regards polio, years back, it was a major problem in Nigeria, but as we speak today, that is not a challenge. So the willingness and the commitment of the people to see change, it's very real, it's very possible. In different quarters, we had Nigeria back in the 90s had very high, maternal and child mortality rates, but today all of those numbers have dropped. It's still one of the highest in the world, I agree with that, but you can see progress over time. So as long as we could see progress over time, it shows us the level of resilience. And most importantly, drawing from the works of Margaret Kroc, something she wrote some years back, during the time of Ebola, talking about building resilient health systems. Our systems need to be more integrated. Our systems need to be more adaptable. And our systems need to be more, open to changes, because these changes are happening each and every moment. So as long as, our systems, the social system, the health system, all of these systems are open to, the current changes that are happening. People are open to the realities that, say, for example, I've been in a conference in the past 2 days making some presentations, and we've been talking about, AI in academic research. How do we address these issues? Whether we like it or not, AI has come to stay. So the question is, how do we build around it? How do we do things in an ethical manner? So the resilience level is there. If the resilience level was not there, you see, COVID-19 that came, some few years back, sincerely, it would have wiped away the entire continent of Africa. But people were resilient. People wanted, to live. People wanted to thrive, and they went all the way out, to listen to the government, to take steps and measures to safeguard themselves, their families, and their communities. So I hope I've answered that. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I have to say that I think both answers, the questions were maybe different, but I really appreciated that, you're providing lived experiences, and that's what makes the difference in both cases. So I appreciate that for both answers, you're providing concrete examples of what really happened. And I think sometimes that's what's missing in the current policy-making process in general. Sometimes we feel it's disconnected from the reality because we don't necessarily hear this kind of experiences and we don't learn from these experiences, especially across countries, I would say. And so thank you for sharing these valuable examples. And I think it would be time now to open the floor for people online that might have questions. I would ask maybe to raise your hand before speaking so we can see you in the screen. And if you have specific questions for one or the other researchers and experts, please state so. And yes, so I would open the floor now.
Perhaps while we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts, I just wanted to respond really quickly to what Dr. Laval said. I think really excellent and stimulating answers. And you're talking about the community buy-in, and I think that's so important. And I tried to mention in our paper a little bit just about social cohesion, social capital, whatever you want to call it. And this just does not get talked enough about, I think, in any sort of circles. And if we're talking about we want societies to do things, we want political, institutional officers to do things, great. It doesn't stick, it doesn't last, it doesn't make the impact if you don't get the affected communities on board, involved in the decision-making process. This gets wrapped up with the inclusive governance that we have been talking about. These things are all interconnected, and I think that is such an important and under-discussed element of you can't do any of the other things we want, any of the other interventions to mitigate the sort of issues of the polycrisis without the buy-in and the sort of communal action that's required. And I think that's a really key point. So I was very happy to see you raise that.
Yeah, absolutely. I would tend to agree, especially for policies, but also projects. I mean, in order for them to be successful, we need to have communities on board. But I see Faith has raised her hand. So please, Faith.
Yeah, I think let me start the question pool, if I can abuse my role as program coordinator. So question for a lot of us who are focusing on the policy element of a lot of these elements, the key aspect of policy is to really begin to see impact and the messaging of some of the recommendations to policymakers, right? So in saying that, I know that both Daniel and Akinyamoa, they basically outlined a couple of recommendations, and some of them were very specific and targeted. So in speaking about beginning to really move the needle, to what extent do you think that there's an observable element of implementation that you can begin to discern a bit of movement towards embracing this adaptive responses to the polycrisis? Are you, if any? So for instance, for you, Daniel, in the case of Egypt, some of the specific recommendations that you're applying, are you beginning to see potential indicators that indicate movement from a policy perspective? Similarly for you, Dr. Lawal, are you beginning to see also, even if it's nascent, but a moving of the needle towards policy shapes or policy thinking in terms of implementation? So I think I would be keen to hear that. There's elements of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Faith, for the comment on this question. And please, the floor is is yours, Daniel and Dr. Lawal.
I don't know if you want to go first. Want me to respond? Either way. I guess I could, just because my mic's already off, I'll jump in quickly. A really good question, Faith. I would say, I mean, first of all, it's so important, and Dr. Law mentioned this as well, that you need to start seeing progress, right? It's hard to continue and sort of sustain the effort that is needed for these interventions if you're not seeing some progress along the way, you're not seeing some signs of hope that we are actually able to tackle some of these issues. I think some of the medical advances are really important. Yeah, you can look to COVID, like COVID was disruptive and terrible, but there were some good lessons in it, the way that certain communities came together, the way that things were resolved maybe even quicker in some respects than people thought. Those are sort of lessons and maybe some highlights that people can do. In Egypt, really the problem is we don't see a lot of, at least, in sort of our analysis, we're not seeing a lot of, let's say, positive or progressive movement along most of these indicators. There's a lot of key indicators. A lot of them are showing, again, high stress, high risk, some efforts to sort of recognize the harshness of some of the dissent crackdowns and sort of releasing certain journalists and sort of commentators who had been arrested. Some efforts being made, but not a lot. In other parts of the continent, you maybe do see some, in Kenya, for example, we had recently been looking at, in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a lot of investment in education, in healthcare, in, really looking after the sort of well-being in the human capital. And so you could see that actually happening, but again, not complete. And it ended up rubbing against it and sort of exposing a disconnect between some of these social investments and public goods investments, which are positive signs, but continuing sort of corruption and cronyism and sort of recent retractions and move towards austerity. And that seems to have sparked some of the recent protests there in the last couple of years. So again, yeah, you can point to signs and that's fantastic, but because everything is so interconnected, a few positive signs and a few dimensions, if the other dimensions are going the opposite way, can actually expose the risk and expose that disconnect and sort of lead to or inflame unrest, let's say. So it's a tricky kind of situation.
Yeah, and I would also describe the situation as trickier. It's really complex, I would say, especially because I imagine many of the policies being pushed by the government are, of course, aligned with their political interests and all of that. I'm also wondering, to some extent, also if it's also in terms of resources available. So if you also have, for example, international partners backing you up for some reforms, you're not looking necessarily at other reforms or other aspects and dimensions because you don't have enough money. So it's very complicated, I would say. And Dr. Lowell, I don't know if you want to also spend some words.
Yes, thank you very much. I think we could see some level of action at the continental level. Take, for example, sometime earlier this year, the African Union and the World Health Organization, at the meeting that was held, the World Health Assembly, there was this renewed commitment to strengthening health systems in Africa. And of course, this is with the aim and with the goal of, addressing issues that has to do with maternal mortality, maternal health, the issues on disease prevention and control, improving, emergency efforts and security issues across the continent, health security issues across the continent. So that's commitment is there, at the continental level. But I think what we need to see more is that drive to get adequate and sufficient political buy-in. So what is said at the global level, what is agreed at the African Union level, is brought down to different countries, bought in by the political class, the political stakeholders, and they take action to realize those things in order for us to have a difference. So I think that's very important. If I'm to go out, all out to, do some new research, I think I want to focus on the strategies on how to influence or make the political class, the political stakeholders think differently, buy into these particular global actions and agreements and actually put them into proper perspectives in order for us to say, yes, we are on the right track towards achieving the SDGs. We are on the right track towards reducing poverty, improving education, improving partnerships within Africa and beyond. So this, I think, is very important. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. Without political willingness, reforms can be on paper really well done, but then there's no implementation, I would say. And it's interesting also because I think in your paper you provide very practical examples of implementation and indicators and how to keep track of the reforms that you're proposing. So that's already for me a good starting point. We have ideas, we know what to do. We just need the policymakers and the political class to listen. So thanks for that. I see Professor Mate with, you wanted to ask a couple of questions?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, for these two great presentations, really head on, I think. Yeah, sometimes it's a bit difficult to stay positive when talking about the Polycrisis, and I appreciate a lot that both papers really, also try to make an effort in pointing out, okay, what could be solutions here. But I'm a bit skeptical, for example, with Egypt, with the current regime in place. I mean, how much of these things that we know are not working as they could, right? So, well, what are the realistic chances of ending crony capitalism, etc.? Or, Egypt will always be like a desert country, which is essentially overpopulated. So there will be food dependency to the external. I think you can't change that overnight. So maybe a realistic assessment from both of you on the big macro conditions that we know have to change, but they're quite difficult to change. And I want follow-up questions. Okay, even if the big macro conditions might not, move quickly in one way or the other, to be realistic. Now, what are like trigger events we should have on our screen, right? So if we can't change the overall mathematics and metrics of the game, then maybe let's be aware of, okay, what could be really unhealthy trigger situations. Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Maybe this time we can start with Dr. Lowell, and then we pass the word to Daniel.
Okay, thank you very much. The mention of Egypt brings back, quite some interesting memories. I remember being there back in, I think this was in the 90s, back in 1996, when I visited, I think it was summer vacation. Egypt today I won't say it's not a failed state. No, it's not. But it's quite a complex issue that we are seeing unfold in Egypt. If we can't move the elephant in the room, those are the macro issues. If we can't address them, then maybe we could look at, initiatives that would help to improve the daily lives of the people. Entrepreneurial, initiatives, look for external funding, that could help to bring in, support small and medium, scale enterprises. With that could help to address, the issues that has to do with poverty, the issues that has to do with social disparities and all of that. When people at the micro level know that, okay, this particular organization, we can go to them, we can get funding, we can scale up our businesses, we can have a better life. I think that's another strategy that we could, another direction in which we could take to begin to address, things at the micro level. Then, of course, it's also very important, we have a lot of NGOs in different parts of the world. I think NGOs could then begin to look at initiatives that they could do that could improve the lives of the people, at the grassroots. So NGOs could come in, specific programs focused on the people. They know they can't change the government. It's not very easy to change, the political class overnight. But I think with these little initiatives at the micro level, we could begin to see some hope and some changes, happening in the country as a whole. So these are my thoughts about this. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks indeed. You also share the necessity indeed to look at this from a different perspective. But please, Daniel, also come in.
Yeah, I mean, that's extremely valuable. I agree entirely. And I think that, as we've been sort of talking about, these issues tend to kind of go both ways, and we can talk about the interconnections between different dimensions of the polycrisis. And we've also been talking about interconnections between the different levels of analysis that we see, the micro, the meso, and the macro. And I think you're right, and I understand where you're coming from, Malta. It is hard to sort of look around the world and say, oh yeah, everything, we're making progress, we're in line, we're on the right track. Certainly not. And a lot of these issues are, very difficult and, don't show a lot of signs for hope. At the same time, let's say the macro level dimensions and sort of problems that we're facing are not disconnected from the micro level as well, right? They are the result of the sort of evolved processes over long periods of time. Again, this is part of why taking the sort of historical viewpoint that we do is so important, to sort of see how, whether it's the global economic system or the finance system or the interconnection between different sort of countries and how this works, this evolves through people's actual decisions in some of these macro level policies. And the reverse can also be true. And I think, as we're saying, the ability to focus on, different communities and raise some sort of well-being and get some sort of buy-in for specific programs. And it's not going to solve everything overnight, but it gets the needle moving in the right sort of direction. This can then create the buy-in, the capital, the awareness of what else is needed to kind of keep that moving. And eventually this can undermine even something like an authoritarian extractive regime. And we see this all the time, right? Those do not, and historically, those can't actually last. Like crony capitalism cannot last impermanently. It can reassert itself. But if you're not doing the job and you're not sort of looking after the community well-being, that comes to the fore eventually, and is often very harsh for those in charge. And so that can, that sort of awareness, that kind of those disconnects can actually create these opportunities for change and demands for change. And you'd like it, the goal is to have that be nonviolent. And so, the little bit of progress that you can make that then raises expectations, raises awareness of where else progress is needed, can really help sharpen that. And, as Dr. Laval is mentioning, we do also see some, at the same time as we're seeing sort of multilateralism internationally fail in many ways, we are seeing some international cooperations. We are seeing some regional agreements within Africa, for example. I mean, Egypt just, I believe, recently came to some agreements with the Congo about sort of water sharing and some kind of resource management regimes. So that's an example, again, of, yes, we are a desert country. We have always been a desert country. We have a large population and very little agricultural land and water, but we have some things, maybe the Congo has a lot of water. We have some things. Let's get into a regional cooperation. You saw even, again, in sort of East Africa, some of the climate early warning detection systems, some of the mitigation strategies are now being conceived of as in a regional kind of sense. And I think that meso level activity can start to then scaffold with some of these micro level activities. And eventually we will see this spiral up and into the macro level. So I am perhaps naively, but I remain hopeful because I do see pathways, I do see mechanisms, and we have seen in the past that these different levels, these different issues do connect and can feed back on each other in more positive ways.
Thanks, that's completely clear. And also, I think very important to stress that sometimes indeed we look at different levels, but indeed everything is so interconnected also between levels that then also these levels can impact one another. I was just wanted to share some thoughts while listening to you. And sometimes I also think a question is also how to then make this polycrisis, let's say, dimension and approach interesting and appealing for the power, because I guess sometimes maybe I'm a bit reducing the problem or simplifying, but if we find a way to show that this is actually in the interest of the autocratic regime or in the people in power, then we can mobilize also something across indeed the different levels. But just to share some thoughts. But I see also Sabine would like to ask a question. Please go ahead.
Okay. Trying to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you to the two of you. That was interesting. I have a follow-up question. My name is Sabina. I'm from University of Tübingen in Germany. And I have also participated in writing a policy brief, but I'm also a co-editor of a book we want to produce on polycrisis. Now everybody knows the polycrisis is very complex, and because it's a polycrisis, we need poly solutions. But that exactly, I think, I mean, it sounds normal, it sounds logical, but it's very difficult to achieve, because if you look at all the, the analysis we can give as scientists, when you look at it, and I did this with my student, and to say, oh my God, it's so complicated, what can we do about it? Where should we start? Now, as an anthropologist, of course, I'm happy to to hear that you are very much favoring the culture-sensitive approaches, because anthropologists is exactly what they do. We are working we are working bottom up, on the micro level. We're not so much engaged with these broad, big data and global structures. We are working on the bottom up. But the problem is that we can say what is happening on the bottom in the communities, and then it stops somewhere. It doesn't go further. We can give all the analysis, we can give them all the facts, we can give this whole entanglement of these complicated structures of problems, and then it stops somewhere. And as you said, we probably have to work on a multi-level scale. We have on all levels have to work. But I would like to ask you as scientists, where would you start? How should we do? Should we give them very, very concrete, not only problem analysis, but also solution analysis, very concrete? Like, take this one example from Nigeria, can you exactly say, if a politician would ask you, there is this Boko Haram group in, I don't know, Kano State or so, what exactly do you suggest to be done? Not just be vague, yeah, this and this has to be tackled. What exactly needs to be done? And I would like to ask you, how should we all proceed to be more successful with all the analysis stuff we are doing now?
Thank you. That's really clear, Sabine. Thank you. And if I can add concrete examples, how should we proceed? And all of this in 2 minutes, because we're finishing our time. So it's going to be challenging. But Dr. Lauer, would you like to start again for this last round of questions?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, it's a big problem, but the polycrisis it's beyond everybody, but there are solutions to it. I believe so. There are solutions to it. So what should be done? It's very important that we identify, I think in the course of my presentation, I mentioned self-interest versus collective interest. As regards the Boko Haram, insurgency, some group of people are trying to hold the country to ransom. That's the sincere truth. We have some vested interests. They are not happy with the policy. They are not happy with the state of things. They believe that they should be the one in charge of these resources. They should be the one controlling certain resources and all of that. These are disgruntled individuals, and they are not very happy with the way things are being run. So they have taken it upon themselves to cause a national level of destabilization. The question is, and we know that these people are not hidden. These people are not hidden. Internally and externally, we have people fueling the crisis in the country as a whole. That's the sincere truth. Identifying them, calling them to the round table, it's not going to be easy. That's the sincere truth. But calling them to the round table and say, we need to address this issue in order for the country to move forward, in order for the country to be better off than what it is. It's never going to be easy, but it is possible. These people are not hidden. The individuals that are fueling this crisis, they are not hidden at all. That's the sincere truth. So that is how we can go about what exactly needs to be done. Then how should we proceed? It's all about the process. You mentioned, do we start from the top to the bottom, or do we go from the bottom to the top? You see, whatever we want to do for people at the bottom, I think it's very important that we begin from the bottom and take the solutions all the way from the bottom, and of course, connecting that with the top. If the issues are macro, then we have to begin, from the macro level, and it will definitely come down all the way to the meso, to the micro level. So it just depends on identifying, is this a macro problem or is this a micro problem? Every one of it is interconnected with one another, no doubt about it. But if we start from the macro point of view, definitely we'll be able to address it coming down. And if we start from the micro, there's always the meeting points. So we could address it from both angles. And I think at the end of the day, we'll have a better society. Obviously, hopefully, I'm being optimistic here, a better world. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Daniel, also 2 minutes for you.
Ooh, yeah, that is tough. I really, really appreciate those words and those thoughts. I would say, first of all, there is no reason that we need our analysis to stop as we're moving up the ladder from the bottom up. You don't have to stop anywhere. You can go from the absolute micro to the absolute macro. And there's a way to connect it. There's a way to connect the sort of qualitative, contextualized information with the big data and the sort of, statistical. No, that's what we do at SODI. I'll give a plug to the complex dynamic systems and systemic risk perspectives. And you can read more and just Google those terms. There are methods for doing exactly this. And this is kind of what we need, again, to confront the polycrisis. You need not only poly solutions, but poly methods to identify those poly solutions. The other thing I'll say, I fully agree with you. And I think, we talk so much about the need for inclusive, representative, responsive governance. That goes all the way down, right? And our role as scientists, our role as policymakers isn't to come and say, here's your solution, here's what you do. Our role is to be part of conversations with as wide of a group of affected people and as a diverse experience and understanding as possible. Bring the people into the room, bring us into the round table. Let's talk about what are your actual needs? What is behind, what is driving this behavior that maybe we identify as being disruptive or dysfunctional? What's actually, what's behind it? What do you need? Here's what we need. Let's come together. There are methods for that kind of consilience. It's hard to scale, but it is possible. And I think this is what we need to do and gives us hope. And I'll go back to something that you said, Sarah, that I think is really important, that, part of, again, why we like looking into the past, and part of what I think sort of let's say, Rachel and my role kind of as historians is to be part of these conversations and say, yeah, you may think this is in your self-interest, you autocratic extractive ruler. Maybe in the short term, it can sort of look like that. In the longer term, you're working against your own interest. The instability that you're generating will come back to you. It will come home to roost as well. I can show you history is littered with people who ruled like you and met very violent, devastating ends. That's not what you want necessarily. But again, that's part of a conversation. That's part of widening the lens with people in the room to say, well, let's think through, okay, it may look like you're making some money here. It may look like you're doing, getting some power for yourself, but are you actually unseating your position in the longer term or even the medium term, and just sort of exposing how these things work to help break through the normal status quo processes and think through, okay, well, maybe this isn't quite how you think it is, and therefore maybe we should be doing something else. Let's talk together and figure out what that something else can be. And I think that sort of broadening the group, raising the amount of voices that are weighing into these issues is absolutely crucial all the way down.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, I think this is a perfect way to end our discussion with a bit of optimism and what's next. And it connects also to the last session, let's say, closing remarks of Professor Malte, that I hope he will forgive us for taking a little bit of his time. But thank you for engaging in this discussion.
Great. We definitely come to the end of this webinar very soon. It's not the end of the project. It's not the end of more policy briefs that we are producing. So if you're interested in our work, just have a look at the chat. So you can, we have a LinkedIn group, we have a newsletter, and of course, we also have a website where you can access today's great presentations, as well as 10 other policy briefs and 10 more that we are producing in the next couple of, I think, 12 or 13 months. Of course, a big thank you to, first of all, our presenters today here. So I think really, I mean, you were discussing like the core issues of the polycrisis in different settings here. So this is absolutely great work. Thanks also go to Faith Mabera, who is working in the background on setting us up here for this webinar, but also, you know, doing the editing, typesetting, and like the production of the policy brief, which is always a little bit more work than you might think it is. And of course, also a big thanks go out to our cooperation partner for this webinar, ECDPM. Again, you know, we had the launch of the policy briefs a couple of months ago, and you know, we really appreciate that cooperation. I like to end on a positive note, which is difficult enough when talking about the polycrisis, because everything looks so dramatically negative. But let's not forget that for example, the SDGs have deliberately been designed to actually create like positive tipping points. And well, I mean, you have mentioned issues like health and education. I have longer and very important other positive side effects. And I also like Daniel's and Rachel's paper, because you're also not pointing us to the problems, but also to the possible solutions. And a couple of times the term solution has been mentioned, and as it happens, you know, the very foundational brief of this series is, you know, really trying to promote that idea that, you know, we also have to look for these poly solutions here. So have a quick look at the chat, so you find the link there. This is all then from my side. Thank you very much for joining us today here, and yeah, now keep in touch, and we'll definitely also have another set of presentations in the coming months. Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.